Great. Welcome to the annual lecture of the Society for Applied Philosophy. As always, the lecture is hosted by the Whitehill Center, though this year the lecture will take place remotely. We won't be in Somerset House, unfortunately. I'm delighted to introduce our speaker for this year, Alan Buchanan. Alan is one of our most prolific and influential moral and political philosophers. He is a professor of philosophy at the University of Arizona, having previously taught at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, University of Minnesota, and Duke University. He has made important contributions on a wide range of issues, from Marxist critique of liberalism, to issue in just war theory, to human rights, to a number of debates related to healthcare. A virtue that many of these works share, one of the many virtues that these works share, is that they identify problems and questions that have been previously neglected in the philosophical discussion. And much of Alan's work in all these areas has been truly groundbreaking, paving the way to a number of rich philosophical debates that followed up on his steps. I'm delighted that he has accepted to give our annual lecture. The title of the lecture is "When Knowing What is Just and Being Committed to Achieving It is Not Enough." So Alan will give his presentation, and then we have four commentators. The commentators are Cécile Fabre, who's Senior Research Fellow at All Souls College and Professor of Political Philosophy at Oxford. Rainer Forst, who's Professor of Political Theory and Philosophy at Goethe University in Frankfurt. Sally Haslanger, the Ford Professor of Philosophy and Women's and Gender Studies at MIT, and Margaret Moore, who's Professor and Director of the Center of Democracy and Diversity at Queen's University in Canada. We have limited time, so I will not add anything else by way of introduction, but one of the advantages of having such a stellar lineup of speakers is that they don't really need an introduction. So without further ado, Alan.
Thank you very much. I'm very honored by being the annual lecturer, and I want to thank the Society and also especially Massimo and Ruth Benton for arranging this. I have to make a remark about this claim that I'm prolific. I'm afraid that when I pass away, people will say he never had an unpublished thought, and I'm not sure that's a good idea. But anyway, volume is one thing, quality is another. Now, the group of commentators is a kind of dream team, and they've all been enormously constructive and charitable in responding to my paper. And they've given me lots of good ideas, which I wish I'd had when I was writing it, although if I had them, I might not have written the paper. That's another possibility. I'm not going to be able to do justice at all to them, so I'll just give you that in advance. And now I'd like to proceed to a brief kind of compressed presentation of the paper via PowerPoint. And so I'm going to be asking Ruth to move the slides through. So the basic idea is that people can know what's just in the sense that they have a grasp of principles of justice, and they can even be motivated to try to realize justice, and yet they can behave in ways that either actually impede progress in justice or at least don't produce it. Next, please. Good. Skip over. Well, I do want to put a plug in for this book, which I think isn't getting the attention that at least I think it deserves. Our Moral Fate, Evolution, and the Escape from Tribalism. It actually has quite a lot about ideology in it, and some of the things I say in that book about ideology, I think respond to some of the criticisms that Rainer and Margaret had about my use of the, and possibly Sally too, that they think apply to my use of the concept of ideology in this paper. Next, please. So here's the main thesis. If people either overestimate the extent to which justice has been achieved or underestimate the prospects for achieving justice, then they can perpetuate injustice even if they have a perfect understanding of valid principles of justice and a robust commitment to realizing them, and have the political influence to make that commitment effective. Next, please. Now, there's two implications of this thesis for how we should think about ideology. Ideologies that include either overly optimistic or overly pessimistic beliefs about progress and justice do not require people to alter or abandon their understanding of principles of justice or to abandon their commitment to realizing them. That's the first implication. Second, other things being equal, ideologies that have this feature that do not require fundamental transformations of their adherents' moral outlooks or motivation are more likely to spread and be sustained. Why? Because they can take hold without having to overcome the resistance of internalized moral principles and also without having to change people's moral motivations. Such ideologies, ones that, as it were, economize on moral change, have higher cultural reproductive fitness, other things being equal. If that's true, then there are especially serious obstacles to progress toward justice. Next, please. Good, thank you. So here's the first kind of false belief about justice that can perpetuate injustice: undue optimism. For example, racial injustices. Many Americans are unaware of the extent of institutionalized racism after the abolition of slavery and the existence of specific racist policies, such as the deliberate exclusion of blacks from the benefits of the New Deal. And second, because of these faulty beliefs, they seriously underestimate the continuing negative effects of racism on African Americans. Three, therefore, they overestimate progress in overcoming racial injustices. Four, they may also fail to grasp the complex extended causal change involved in the continuation of racism. They may overlook structural injustices, focusing only on the fact that they haven't witnessed overtly racist actions by particular individuals. And five, so they mistakenly believe that policies to combat racial injustice are a low priority. Next, please. Conclusion: if people have faulty beliefs that lead them to overestimate how much progress has been made in remedying racial injustices, they can act in ways that perpetuate those injustices, even though, one, they have a good grasp of valid principles of justice, in this case, principles prohibiting racial injustice, and two, a robust commitment to realizing those principles, and three, have the political influence to make their commitments effective. And the same is true for gender injustices. I say more about gender injustices than I'm going to say now, but the argument applies, I think, equally to them. Next, please. Now, at this point, there's a kind of obvious objection, and as we'll see, Reiner and Margaret think I haven't met the objection adequately, so we'll see about that later. The objection is that being committed to justice means, other things being equal, taking seriously the need to get the facts right, the facts that are relevant to acting on that commitment. And that includes the facts about how much progress has or hasn't been made toward achieving justice. So the complicity with injustice that I've described is not compatible with the assumption that the people in question have a robust commitment to justice. Next, please. Here's my attempt to rebut that, and it's inadequate in the paper, certainly going to be more inadequate right now. And I think I need to think more about this. It's true that any commitment worthy of the name involves some epistemic responsibilities. If someone appears to be committed to X, but willfully avoids getting information relevant to determining what to do in order to achieve X, or if she is unambiguously confronted with evidence that her assumptions about how to achieve X are mistaken and ignores it, then we may conclude that she's not really committed to X or that her commitment is weak. However, and I should put a quantifier here, at least in some of the cases of racial injustice described earlier, that need not be the case. People can hold faulty beliefs that lead them to overestimate progress toward racial justice without indulging in any of these epistemic vices. Next, please. Not sure why it's taking so long. I'm sorry about that. Maybe it'll give you more time to read over the too much text I have in the PowerPoints. Okay, so here's the idea. If false beliefs about the extent of progress toward justice are pervasive in your society and are almost uniformly fostered by school textbooks that minimize the gravity and extent of racial injustice, and these faulty beliefs are endorsed by those who are widely regarded as reliable sources of information in your society according to that society's dominant epistemic norms and practices, and if you've not experienced any serious challenges to these faulty beliefs, then it seems excessively demanding to say that having these faulty beliefs is incompatible with being genuinely committed to the pursuit of justice. Now, I'm treading a fine line here between saying that we're sort of determined by our social epistemic environment and can't be faulted for taking exception to anything that's encouraged by it on the one hand, and having too demanding a view about what's expected, that should be expected of individuals by way of epistemic responsibilities on the other. And I may not have reached that balance point properly. Next, please. So here's the other wing of the paper, focused on optimism before, now about pessimism about prospects for justice and how that can perpetuate injustice. So here's the main thesis. If enough people with political influence believe that significant gains in the pursuit of justice are not possible, or highly unlikely, let's say, then initiatives to remedy those injustices may lack sufficient support or may not even be proposed. Now, what are some of the sources of undue pessimism about the prospects for achieving justice? Well, they could be assumptions about the limitations of human nature. Many conservative thinkers, including Burke and contemporary, what I call Evo conservatives, people who have conservative views about what's possible because of their views about the evolution of the moral mind, those are people who may be unduly pessimistic about the prospects for achieving justice. Or there may be the assumption that existing and persisting inequalities in power make justice an illusion, or at least make it extremely unlikely. I think if you think it's totally an illusion, you just might abandon the idea of that there is such a thing as justice. And I'm thinking here of things like what Thrasymachus says in one of the Platonic dialogues, Socratic dialogues, and also about the Melian dialogue, and about the simpler forms of realist theories of international relations. The latter are interesting because they don't hold that justice is illusory. They just hold that it's illusory in the domain of international relations. And so it's not as if they don't have a concept of justice. It's just they think that it doesn't apply in that area because of the lack of a central global authority and the huge power disparities among countries. Another assumption that can make you overly pessimistic is to think that society is so complex and our understanding of how it works is so meager and will remain meager that attempts to make things better are likely to be futile or backfire or be at least extremely ineffective. And I'm thinking of people like Hayek and his cruder moments. Next, please. So what about ideologies? Well, I want to explore the idea that ideologies that foster and sustain false or unjustified beliefs about progress can either foster optimism or pessimism. And when they do, they're especially dangerous from the standpoint of progress and justice because ideologies typically include beliefs that are extremely recalcitrant to correction. Ideologies have what I call doxastic immune systems. Next, please. Now, at this point, I have a disagreement with at least Marxist ideology conceptions as I understand them, and I may be wrong about this, and Sally can correct me, and so can Reiner. According to Marxist conceptions of ideology, broadly construed, I don't just mean Marx's, but Frankfurt School and other ideology theories in that tradition, ideologies support unjust orders by masking injustices. I mean, they might present what are really injustices as natural and hence as inevitable, or they might just veil them completely. But false ideologies, in my view, can do more than that. I think that the masking function is typical and pervasive in ideologies, at least certain kinds of ideologies. But I think they can also support unjust social orders without masking the ideologies. That is, the beliefs that are contained in the ideology don't have to amount to a denial of the existence of injustices, but they can underestimate them, or they can present them as being somehow things that can't feasibly be remedied. So in a way, this is a kind of modification of that I think fits in well with the ideology in the Marxist tradition, but I think at very least, it shows that if masking means completely shielding from view, that's not the only way in which ideologies can support unjust social orders. Next, please. Now, I mentioned this at the very beginning, but I think there's a selective advantage in terms of cultural selection of ideologies that economize on moral change. When ideologies contain either overly optimistic or overly pessimistic beliefs about progress toward justice, they economize on moral change in this sense. They don't require their adherents to abandon their fundamental moral principles or their commitment to them. And that's a huge advantage in terms of cultural fitness for that kind of ideology. They're more likely to spread and endure than ideologies that require fundamental moral changes. Why is that? Well, because they don't have to overcome the psychological resistance or internalized moral principles of their adherents to be effective in changing the way those people look at the world and changing how they act. Next, please. So here's the conclusion. Making progress toward justice isn't just a matter of getting people to accept and be committed to realizing valid principles of justice or facilitating the political empowerment of those people, or I might add, ramping up their motivation to achieve justice. It also requires combating overly optimistic and overly pessimistic beliefs about progress toward justice. And that will require combating ideologies that foster and sustain such beliefs. Thank you.
Great, Alan. Great presentation. So we have our first commentator, Cécile Fabre.
That's great. Thank you very much, Massimo. Let me begin by thanking Elizabeth Brake and the editors of the journal for inviting me to take part in the symposium. I have enormous admiration for Alan as a moral and political philosopher and as a person, and it is therefore both a pleasure and an honor to be responding to him this afternoon. In his lecture, Alan makes claims about beliefs that we entertain about prospects for justice on the one hand, and ideologies on the other hand. In my reply, I will only talk about beliefs. I won't have anything to say about ideologies. And I should also say, by way of prefatory comment, that as those of you who are here today and who know me, I'm generally not a fan of the bloodbath approach to responding to other people's work. So my approach this afternoon in particular will be very constructive. That's partly also because I agree in this paper, as most of the time, with almost everything that Alan says. What I want to do instead is to show if I can, that if we take his remarks about pessimism and optimism seriously, and I think that we should take them seriously, then prospects for the realization of justice, in fact, are very bleak, and perhaps bleaker than he acknowledges in the paper. So I want to proceed in two steps. First of all, I want to expand his taxonomy of beliefs about justice. And then I want to show that what he says about optimistic and pessimistic beliefs about justice and the extended taxonomy I provide applies not just to justice as we traditionally think of, racial justice, gender justice, economic justice, and so on, but also to epistemic justice. So let me begin then with expanding the taxonomy. So as we heard, Alan argues, and I really think he's right here, that having the correct beliefs about justice and the proper commitment to its realization is really not enough for justice to be realized. If we are unduly optimistic about the degree to which justice has progressed so far, and or unduly pessimistic about progress for justice in the future, well, then we will fail to realize justice. Those beliefs, those unduly pessimistic and unduly optimistic beliefs about justice are what I call doxastic handicaps. So I've coined the term, but of course it echoes Alan's wonderfully apt description of ideologies as doxastic immune systems. As Alan's example suggests, our mistaken beliefs about achieving justice can be evaluated alongside two dimensions: their mood on the one hand, namely pessimism and optimism, but also their temporal direction, what has been done so far, what can be done next. Well, with that set of those two distinctions in hand, well, then we should look at what we may call forward-looking. Let me start again. We should consider the possibility that in just the same way as we can suffer from backward-looking false optimism and forward-looking false pessimism, well, we can suffer from backward-looking false pessimism and forward-looking false optimism. So imagine an agent, I'm going to call her Anne, who believes that justice requires the eradication of global poverty. Let's assume that she's correct. Let's also assume that she's fully committed to it. However, she falsely underestimates the gains achieved so far. And there are two ways in which her backward-looking false pessimism might get in the way of the realization of justice. First, it is likely to foster and deepen her similarly false forward-looking pessimism, with the consequences to which Alan alerts us. Second, she will also end up doing or offering the wrong kind of trade-off. So this is what I mean. Her belief in serious lack of progress to date in the domain that I have in mind, say economic justice, might lead her to neglect other justice-related goals, for example, environmental justice. Suppose that she is correct that under conditions of scarcity and motivational failures on the part of other people, justice, all things considered, demands a particular kind of trade-off between economic justice and environmental justice. However, if she is falsely pessimistic about what has been done so far in the domain of economic justice, she might end up promoting the wrong kind, an unjust kind of trade-off, thereby contributing to a all things considered unjust state of affairs. And you can run a similar argument with respect to false optimism about prospects for achieving justice. So the picture already looks, quite bad. If we take seriously, the mood and the temporal direction of those beliefs, then we have four doxastic handicaps to contend with. The picture looks even worse if we consider what I have referred to as epistemic justice. And here I have two broad points in mind. First, we are under epistemic duties to find out the facts which are relevant to implementing non-epistemic justice. Duties to find out how scarce resources are, how robustly committed other agents are to cooperate with us to achieve justice, how effective the institutions through which we will implement our justice-related goals are. Now, if implementing a principle of justice P requires that certain facts obtain, and if we cannot implement P unless we know whether those facts do obtain, our failure to acquire that knowledge can itself, under certain conditions, be a failure at the bar of justice. Suppose that this is correct. Well, in order to fulfill our epistemic duties of justice, we need to have access to epistemic goods, such as education, an open and free press, testimonial evidence as to progress made so far, and so on and so forth. Once we see this, well, it seems to me that we can see easily how doxastic handicaps can get in the way of realizing epistemic justice so construed as access to epistemic goods. So to illustrate, suppose that Anne is robustly committed to epistemic justice. She believes that she's under epistemic duties to acquire the correct factual beliefs, not just about what it takes to achieve, for example, a just vaccine distribution or racial justice, but also about what it takes to achieve justice as access to epistemic goods. She is also appropriately motivated to fulfill her epistemic duties. Suppose, however, that she falsely believes that much progress has already been made towards achieving justice as access to epistemic goods. For example, she falsely believes that reforms to the education system to date have rendered that system up to the task of ensuring such access. Or she believes, let us suppose falsely, that internet and social media giants will take adequate steps so as to considerably reduce the spread of fake news and racial hatred. Let's suppose that she's not alone in entertaining those false beliefs. Well, there is a heightened risk that she and other agents will work far less hard towards achieving epistemic justice so construed, again, construed as access to epistemic goods. False optimism, whichever its temporal direction, will stymie the realization of epistemic justice and thereby, in my example, of racial and health justice. And again, the same goes with false pessimism about justice. My second broad point about epistemic justice is this. So far, I have construed it as access to epistemic goods. But as Miranda Fricke argues in her seminal work, there is another form of epistemic justice, namely justice in the way agents are treated as knowers and producers of social meanings. To treat someone unjustly as a knower is to commit testimonial injustice, and a paradigmatic example is when someone's views or testimony is discounted on the grounds that she belongs to an ethnic minority or is a woman. To treat someone unjustly as a producer of social meaning is to commit hermeneutical injustice, and this occurs when a society's interpretive resources are structured in such a way that some agent cannot begin to make sense of a significant dimension of her personal and social life and is harmed as a result. And the paradigmatic example here, at least in Fricke's work, is that of women who suffered from what we now call sexual harassment, but which, until the term and its negative valence entered widely shared public discourse, was described as harmless flirting. Now, testimonial and hermeneutical injustice in general and credibility deficits suffered by otherwise already dominated epistemic agents in particular require that we all strive to develop the epistemic virtues of humility and open-mindedness in our ordinary lives, but they also require structural remedies in the form precisely of the aforementioned epistemic goods, such as a decent education system, a free and fair press, and so on. And of course, as you will have surmised by now, to realize epistemic so understood, it is not enough that we should be robustly committed to it. We must also form the correct factual beliefs as to what has been done to date and what can be done in the future. So to finish briefly, if my arguments so far are correct, they lead to the conclusion that awareness of doxastic handicaps and commitment to overcoming those handicaps are not enough. We also need not to be hampered in those efforts by those handicaps themselves. Being aware that one is, as the case may be, unduly pessimistic or optimistic about any of those things is one thing. But if we are unduly pessimistic or optimistic about our ability to overcome those very same doxastic dispositions, well, then prospects for justice will be very dim indeed. Then again, perhaps I am in saying as much unduly pessimistic myself, though I hope not culpably so. Thank you very much.
Great, thank you, Cécile. Rainer, you're next.
Okay, thank you, Massimo. Thanks to the Society for having me. It's a great pleasure to be part of this group, even though in digital mode, I'd rather be in some place together with you guys. It's also a great pleasure and challenge to comment on Alan's wonderful paper, and also, of course, wonderful to be part of this group of colleagues. Now Alan poses a provocative puzzle to us. He argues that it is possible that someone perfectly, as he says, knows what is right in terms of justice and still doesn't see what is wrong in a society. You know what's right, you don't see what's wrong, at least in the society you live in. Or, that's the pessimism part, you don't believe that justice as you think is right can be realized due to the limits of human nature as well as to limits of social functioning and social structure. So like my other colleagues, I'm interested in that disconnect between factual and normative beliefs, which Alan stresses so much in this paper, and so I see it as a provocation, and I just want to raise some questions about that disconnect. I find it a little hard to imagine that the normative beliefs about justice of a person are firm or well-founded, as Alan says, when he or she shows an extreme inability to identify the presence and pervasiveness of injustice. I think we agree that justice is a practical concept. It guides action. And so knowledge of that concept must also be practical knowledge and a commitment to not just a concept, but a conception of egalitarian justice, which is, I take it, what Alan, what is in the background of Alan's argument. So the practical knowledge and the practical commitment to justice, I think, implies that there has to be some connection between recognizing what justice demands in principle and recognizing what justice demands in practice. The faculty of judgment that is required by a certain understanding, or definitely by a perfect grasp of justice, has to work with a competence in the space of justifications, so that you can combine an understanding of a principle with an understanding of practice. In other words, understanding what justice means that it is a response, a practical response to injustice. So if you lack a proper faculty of judgment about injustice in general, as well as a social reality, do you really have a firm grasp of a conception of justice, especially of an egalitarian one? So that is basically my question about the undue optimism part. It seems to me that a lack of competence of making practical judgments about the injustice of your society, especially if it is, as Alan says, deep-seated structural, say, racial or gender injustice, that lack of competence seems to me to reach into the core knowledge and commitment about justice. So how firm is that commitment? How deep is that knowledge? It seems to me the knowledge is more superficial. If you think you are an egalitarian, but are incapable of seeing the injustice if it is a fact about your society. So in his response, Alan was referring to the commitment part that Margaret and me and also others have questions about, but I think there's also a question about the knowledge part. How firm is your knowledge if you lack the faculty of judgment to apply that knowledge to social reality? With the second case, that of undue pessimism, I think what Alan refers to as false factual beliefs reaches even deeper into the core knowledge of justice, namely, if these beliefs are about human nature being egoistic or being inherently selfish, as he says, so standard ideas of what Alan calls reactionary discourse. If you hold such beliefs about human nature, then it seems to me that a conception of egalitarian justice has difficulties to get a hold of your understanding. It seems to me that if you believe either in a Hobbesian way or in a Hayekian way certain things about human nature or social functioning, then that determines your normative beliefs, not just your factual beliefs about whether justice can be realized. And so I think here, with respect to both aspects, undue optimism and undue pessimism, I think the ideology that Alan points to, and I think rightly points to, is not just an ideological aspect of our factual beliefs. It is also ideological aspects of our normative beliefs, of people who think they are egalitarian, but in fact may not be because of a certain lack of competency of practical judgment, and because of certain beliefs about human nature. I will stop here and not say anything more about ideology. I'm glad to leave this to Sally if she wants to raise this, but I think I'll stop with the last remark. I'm not so sure whether the kind of ideology Alan points to about false factual beliefs is really a case, is really not a case of masking injustice. I think it is a different case of masking injustice that works mainly with false epistemic factual beliefs, but I think it is also a case of masking, because people who hold these beliefs, undue optimistic or unduly pessimistic, do not see certain injustices that are, however, present in their societies. And so I think a different form of masking, but still masking, is going on.
Thank you, Rainer. Sally.
Thank you. Thanks to everybody who's been part of this, and to Alan for his work and the journal. I'm going to say some things that are a bit repetitive, perhaps, but They come at the issues, I think, from a slightly different angle, so I'm hopeful that they're still worthwhile. So, Alan, as I read your discussion, there are at least 3 points you want to make. First is that individuals with a perfect grasp of the principles of justice may nevertheless fail to act in ways that combat justice because they have false empirical beliefs about how far our actual conditions are from achieving justice, or have pessimistic ideas about what is possible. Second, you want to claim that in some cases we may be fully epistemically responsible while holding false empirical beliefs about the injustice of our actual circumstances. And in your paper, you emphasize 3 things. I think it's slightly different in your presentation, but as I read the paper, it was because humans are predisposed to believe what others around them believe. We are social knowers. Second, it's costly to believe, it's costly to be critical of the status quo. And finally, effective coordination with others requires shared belief, even if the belief is false. So that's the second claim. And the third is that ideologies are sets of beliefs that are resistant to correction or modification, and they may include both empirical and evaluative propositions. And ideologies need not always mask injustice, as Marxians would suggest, but may acknowledge injustice, but suggest that achieving it is impossible or impracticable. And conservative ideologies are more likely to do this than liberal or progressive ones. So I'm broadly in agreement with what you say, and I really would like to extend and probe the ideas a bit further. So let's start with the first, that individuals with a perfect grasp of justice may nevertheless fail to act because of their empirical beliefs. Well, I agree completely that because the application of any moral principle involves making judgments about the facts at hand, it's not surprising that ignorance, self-deception, limitations of time, energy, inquiry, and also ideology prevent everyone from living up to their own moral standards. Think of the poor act utilitarian who has to consider all the consequences of every possible action in order to judge what ought to be done. That is an obstacle to social justice. I wonder, though, what it even means to claim that they have a perfect grasp of the principles of justice. So I want to know what those principles really look like and what it is to grasp them. Note that even an explicit set of propositions like the 10 Commandments does not entail a determinate list of what one ought and ought not to do. There's lots of room for interpretation, further specification, reasonable disagreement about application to cases. And these interpretations are a matter of both normative and non-normative inquiry, especially when the principles include thick moral terms that are not obviously decomposable into purely normative and purely empirical elements. What is exactly involved in honoring one's parents, for example? What specific actions are required? So the general point I have here is that pure principles of justice are never action guiding. They always require some kind of supplementation by empirical knowledge, empirical facts, and such like that. So why would we expect that perfect grasp of these pure principles is going to guide us? But apart from indeterminacy, what amounts to having a perfect grasp of the principles of justice? Many of us can recite the 10 Commandments or other moral codes. We're maybe committed to them without fully understanding them or embracing them or appreciating their full significance. Such recitation, even perfect recitation, isn't sufficient for a perfect grasp, of course. But could one really have a perfect grasp of the wrongs of racism and go blithely about one's business thinking that we've achieved a non-racist society? Consider Eric, an ordinary, white, able-bodied, middle-class, straight, cis man. He knows we ought to be anti-racist and also believes that racism is no longer an issue. But I think Eric has no clue what racism is. And the fact that he thinks that racism isn't an issue is evidence that he doesn't grasp the relevant moral principle. So I'm not wholly convinced that empirical ignorance is easily separated from moral ignorance, or that grasping so-called principles of justice is ever much help. Okay, so let's turn to the issue of epistemic responsibility. Alan's claim was that we are not epistemically irresponsible if we believe the status quo. So at first glance, it appears that there's a background assumption that ought implies can, and we can't help but believe what others around us believe. So this is the fact that we're social knowers, and it's true that there's a disposition to believe what others around us believe. But even if we're social beings, we aren't determined to accept the dominant beliefs. A critical perspective is always possible, and we see that all the time. The two other considerations about the costs and benefits of accepting the dominant belief seem to me prudential considerations rather than epistemic considerations. And I think it's really important to separate epistemic and prudential, and even epistemic and moral responsibility. It may be costly for Eric to believe that racism is an ongoing problem given the community he lives in, but he has a vast amount of reliable information about structural racism available to him. And either he's being epistemically negligent in avoiding it, or is not updating his beliefs in response to the evidence. In either case, he's epistemically irresponsible. Now, there's some cases where we might allow for excuses. Eric's young son, Cameron, might be excused because he's not gained sufficient epistemic autonomy. Others, perhaps those in the grip of a cult, have compromised epistemic autonomy. But most of us, and I think Eric included, are sufficiently epistemically autonomous to hold them responsible. Okay, so the third point was that the dominant Marxian or critical theory accounts of ideology just talk about masking ideology, and this is insufficient. So as I understand your argument, there are two concerns. First, not all ideologies mask injustice because they may allow us to simply downplay it. And second, ideologies are not simply false or unwarranted beliefs, but are self-sustaining doxastic systems that prevent the proper uptake of new evidence. Now, I'd love to have a long discussion about ideology, but I'm going to try and keep this kind of more precise than that. So you're right that critical theorists include a functionalist condition in what it takes for a system of attitudes to be ideological. It must function to sustain domination, but it might do so in a variety of ways, sometimes by masking, sometimes distorting, sometimes deflecting. I don't see masking as the single way to sustain domination. So I'd assume that the critical theorist, because I include myself as a critical theorist, could easily agree with you. On my own view, ideologies sometimes make themselves true. And so ideologies need not even be false. They may reveal facts about the world, but the problem lies in their partiality, ambiguity, and the implicatures they seem to license. Yet we still need to ask, does the traditional account explain why an individual in the grip of an ideology is resistant to new evidence? It's hard to know what traditional account of ideology you're criticizing. But as I read the tradition, it would be wrong to characterize ideology as just a set of beliefs and other attitudes. Consider, for example, Rahel Yegi. She says, ideologies are ideas, but they're not just some disconnected ideas one might have or not have. Rather, they're ideas that necessarily, or at any rate systematically, exist and evolve under particular conditions. Ideologies constitute our relation to the world and thus determine the horizons of our interpretation of the world, or the framework in which we understand both ourselves and the social conditions and the way we operate within these conditions. I have another quote I'll skip for the purposes of the time. Robin Selakatis is even more explicit in characterizing the ways in which ideologies are self-sustaining. He says, when social conditions occur that obstruct the development and the exercise of reflective capacities and the corresponding practices of justification and critique, I propose we might speak of second-order pathologies which manifest themselves in structural reflexivity deficits on the part of the agents. The unquestioned guise of legitimacy or naturalness of problematic social practices and institutions, which could, of course, be called ideology, can therefore be situated at a second level, for it prevents or complicates reflection on and critique of opinions, preferences, ways of acting, and social contexts at the first level. So these are both views which seem to me make explicit effort to talk about how ideologies are self-sustaining. And again, on my own view, because ideologies can make themselves true, there's material reinforcement that warrants belief, although because our ideology also licenses problematic inferential patterns and communicative practices, we end up making both empirical and normative errors. So overall, I find the main ideas of the paper compelling. In particular, I agree with you that empirical matters are of utmost importance in understanding our normative commitments and normative failings. And in this, I go back to Brandt on the difference between fundamental and non-fundamental moral disagreement. Empirical, because we need action guiding principles that are always going to embed empirical or factual considerations. It's crucial that we have some understanding of the facts in order to be moral. However, I find myself wanting a bit more engagement with the critical theory tradition, the social epistemology literature, and the literature on the epistemology of ignorance. And I hope such engagement will provide many opportunities for further discussion. Thank you so much.
Great, thank you, Sally. And our final commentator, Margaret Moore. Margaret.
Thank you. So thanks very much for inviting me, Massimo, Elizabeth Brake. Can you hear me all right? Yeah, okay. It's especially an honor to be commenting on Alan Buchanan's terrific paper, especially for me because I've learned an enormous amount from his work. And the usual trajectory is I have very different intuitions, and I think Alan's wrong. And then over time, I come around to having a position that looks frighteningly similar to Alan's position. So we'll see if this happens this time. And so the comments are meant to be quick, so I won't reconstruct the argument, but just raise 3 questions about the general argumentation. And because I'm last, I fear this may be a bit repetitive. I'll try to frame it in my way. So I'll begin in reverse order to the presentation in the paper, focusing on the way Buchanan defines ideologies in a relatively free-floating or detached way. His definition of what counts as an ideology is different from what I took to be the usual view of an ideology, not that I've ever worked on it, but which contends not only that it's a systematically connected set of beliefs and patterns of thinking that orient one to our social environment, which as Buchanan defines it, but in addition that these systems of belief operate in the context of unequal power and are propagated by agents who have an interest in people believing these things. That's how I always think of an ideology. But for Buchanan, an ideology is disconnected from the wider system of power and domination, but are simply belief systems that people hold that are systematic, which means that we all have ideology. It allows him to more easily criticize the Marxist view of ideology, and it's consonant with the psychological framing which he adopts, which it also kind of individualizes the problem. So I guess my first question was, I wasn't entirely persuaded about the view his view of an ideology, which is surely a pejorative term, that it's simply a systematic set of beliefs that orient the individual to their social world. Or at least I would have liked a bit of a defense of that definition. Although it's a short paper. I mean, it's only so much you can do in a paper. But one worry I had is the effect of individualizing the problem, to see it at the level of the individual agent rather than structures of power. This brings me to the second and third points, which are, well, I think they're related, hopefully. So at the beginning of the paper, Buchanan describes his view that people can have a perfect understanding of the valid principles of justice, but that progress is stymied by the fact that they overestimate or underestimates the prospects for achieving it, which he then describes in terms of psychological framing in terms of optimism and pessimism. When I think about optimism and pessimism, at least ordinarily, they're used to describe a kind of psychological propensity to be either hopeful for the future or sometimes to see the worst aspects of things or believe the worst case scenario will happen. And this is often described as a settled character trait. But to call views about racial justice optimistic or pessimistic suggests a kind of individual propensity about just those things themselves. And you normally think that people are optimistic or pessimistic a little bit across the board. In any case, if you just made that claim about racial justice, I think it would be strange to use the terms optimistic and pessimistic. It looks much more like you're just ruling out some considerations from the beginning, like taking them off the table, either on the grounds that the policy or practice is infeasible or extraordinarily costly, that would be the pessimistic view, or the optimistic view that the policies are unnecessary because racial justice has been achieved, so there's no point in discussing them. That gets me to the next point, which is about the connection between the empirical and normative here, which is very similar to what Reiner said. So So let me turn to the idea that people realize what justice is, and as Buchanan says, have an unwavering commitment to it, but they think it's not possible to attain it. So one concern about this formulation is it seems to sidestep a wider controversy about the extent to which people's views on empirical matters or on what is feasible connects to the principles of justice that they hold. And I think that empirical and normative considerations are different, and I think that feasibility considerations are distinct from justice considerations, but not as detached as Buchanan's formulations suggest. I would have thought it a little bit odd to hold this view systematically, because normally one's views about empirical matters like human nature affect or inform their views about justice. Even someone's views about what's feasible, it looks like it informs principles of justice, like on a Rawlsian account, for example. Not that we think that feasibility, obviously feasibility constraints and justice are distinct, but often we think that the principles of justice should reflect our assessment of what is achievable, and maybe not in the immediate future, but over a period of time in a number of different steps. So of course, Buchanan could come back to me and say, well, that this issue is unresolved, and that his formulation has the nice effect that it separates the two issues, normative and empirical, justice and feasibility, neatly, and it does. But even if it does this, I'm not sure that the right way to characterize it is in terms of holding an optimistic or pessimistic empirical view about our prospects for achieving justice. So like the view of ideology, it tends to individualize the problem, make it a matter of individual psychological propensity, when it might be connected to wider views about priorities about just action themselves. So let me now turn to Buchanan's views about the psychological mechanisms at play when people display what he calls undue optimism or pessimism about the extent to which we've achieved justice. And this discussion is related to anticipating an objection that the person who underestimates or overestimates is in fact failing an epistemic duty to find out the truth. So Buchanan considers this and has a good discussion of this. So I agree with Buchanan that there are circumstances in which talk of epistemic duties doesn't treat seriously the difficulty that ordinary people may experience in interpreting complex interactive systems such as institutionalized racism, or they may have a faulty knowledge of history which feeds into a failure to understand complex structural ways that racism gets reproduced. But even so, I don't think that this addresses the situation that we're in part because if we reflect on the Black Lives Matter and related protests in Canada, we've got a similar problem with Indigenous people, where affected individuals have loudly and with ample video evidence say that white police are killing Black people at a disproportionate rate with excessive force and with little institutional mechanisms to hold them to account. It's hard in the face of these protests, and especially with, sometimes with video evidence of excessive discriminatory violence against one community, that one can plead empirical ignorance or just an empirical faulty belief. So I would suggest here that it's difficult to view the problem, at least of racial justice and injustice, which is Buchanan's main example, through the lens of psychological propensities of optimism and pessimism. What is more likely is that people do not really fully accept the principles and do not hold an unwavering commitment to realizing them. Indeed, why would they have an unwavering commitment to realizing the principles if they view the problem as actually solved and unnecessary because, say, racial justice has been achieved? Or why would they hold an unwavering commitment to realizing them if they think it's just impossible to do so or not feasible to address? So, I agree that there's a really interesting problem here about the interconnection between empirical and normative claims that I think that Alan's tackling, but so let me just sum up as best I can with these somewhat disparate remarks. So Buchanan is, I think, right about the ideological nature of these beliefs in the sense that once these beliefs are in place, they have independent power to hinder our progress towards justice. But I think it's not clear, at least in the examples that he gives, that we should assume that there is some kind of independent psychological propensity which doesn't implicate people's fundamental normative commitments and motivations. And I also think these normative and empirical commitments are not independent, simply independent psychological proclivities, but they can be analyzed structurally in terms of the interests that are served in perpetuating these sets of beliefs. But if that's right, then Buchanan's analysis of the ideological nature of the problem is correct. But the puzzle at the beginning is perhaps overstated. Such people do not really have a firm grasp of valid principles of justice and an unwavering commitment to their realization. Thank you.
Thank you, Margaret, and thank you to all of you, to all the commentators. So we are running a bit late on our schedule, so I suggest that we go straight to Alan's quick remarks, just a few minutes. Of course, you're not expected to address all these questions, though there were some themes that kind of run across all the comments. So feel free to say a few words if you like, and then I'd like to take at least a couple of questions from the audience.
I was hoping we were going to have a break so that I could get some more caffeine into my
okay, yeah, okay.
You're the master of ceremonies. You decide. I'll try to do my best. Overall, I want to make a comment that I think applies to most of what the commentators have said, and then I'll proceed to try to address, albeit inadequately, what each of them said. I think there are really two ways to interpret the phenomenon that I've been investigating in this paper. One is the way that I've interpreted them, namely that people can have a good grasp of principles of justice and strong motivation to realize them and still not achieve justice and in fact be impediments to justice. The other is, and this I think is what would be more consonant with what Margaret and Reiner have said, is that having a grasp of principles of justice is a hell of a lot more demanding and complicated than many people who write about justice have thought, right? I mean, they proceed as if, gee, if everybody just agreed with the principles of justice that I'm arguing for in my theory and really cared about justice, then we'd be on the way toward progress in justice. But I think one way of interpreting what Reiner and Margaret have said, and also I think this is part of what Sally's getting at too, is that having a grasp of principles of justice in one important sense of the notion of having a grasp is something that requires, as Reiner put it, practical competence and requires a large background of quite deep beliefs about society and human nature, right? So, I mean, that's one way of interpreting. The reason I wrote this paper was that I just was suspicious and worried that a lot of people theorizing justice were sort of naively thinking that if people just converged on the right principles of justice and cared about justice, we'd be on our way. But I think that another way to frame that worry than the way that I did it in this paper is to say, look, there's a lot more to having a grasp of principles of justice than you might think. So this is sort of a conciliatory gesture on my part, hoping that people might sort of get some of the main ideas of the paper, but put them to use in a quite different way. Okay, now let me just try to go through, and it's going to be really terribly inadequate to address some of the specific things that different people said. I was delighted that Cécile pretty much agrees with what I say in the paper, and I think she's really augmented the project, and I hope she'll make it her own, the project her own, and made it much more important and powerful. I especially like the fact that what she calls doxastic handicaps, I like that phrase too, can impede justice by preventing us from seeing the need to develop institutions that would specify and fairly distribute duties of justice. I mean, I tend to think that, any significant moral principles, including principles of justice, have a kind of indeterminacy, and that often it's the case that only through institutions can they become specified. I think the idea of property rights is a good example of that. And so if you don't think there's a problem, you won't be working to try to develop the institutions that would then enable you to actually know what justice specifically requires. So I think that's an important point. I also really like her development of the connection between doxastic handicaps and various forms of epistemic injustice. And, you know, I'm sort of embarrassed that I didn't think of that, because in a way, I mean, this is a paper on social moral epistemology, and I should have really thought about that. And I would really, I hope that she'll pursue, and I'll try to pursue that avenue of extending the general thrust of the project. Now, with respect to Sally's remarks, you know, they were very rich, and I really agree that I need to engage more with the critical theory tradition. As to the social epistemology literature, I think I've engaged with that. I think I've contributed to it. And one of the things that Sally emphasizes about ideologies is that, as she puts it, they make themselves true. And I think this is incredibly important, and I've written quite a bit about this. I mean, a good example would be, you know, you grow up in a sexist society that assigns to women pretty much exclusively a domestic role, and all you see is women performing that role. And you don't see that women can perform well in other kinds of roles, in politics and business and things like that. So your social experience seems to confirm the beliefs which in fact helped create and sustain that social reality. And I think that one cannot overemphasize that. That's incredibly important. And I didn't really say anything about it in this paper, and I think it's probably relevant. It's certainly relevant in clarifying what I mean by ideology. Also, I gave a really sort of poorly truncated description of what I mean by ideology in this paper. In my book, Our Moral Fate, Evolution and the Escape from Tribalism, I talk a lot more about ideology. And I think what I say there is a lot more in tune with the way Sally thinks about ideologies. I don't think they're just belief systems at all. I agree with Sally's critique of the sort of overly cognitive conceptions of ideology. I think they're something more like evaluative social maps, but they include attitudes, not just beliefs, but attitudes and styles of processing beliefs, cognitive styles and practices. And here I want to say something about Margaret's criticism of my notion of ideology. I don't think that ideologies are just a matter of individual psychology at all. I mean, I distinguish between what ideologies are in terms of what it is for an individual to adhere to an ideology, but that's completely compatible with understanding that ideologies are only produced because of larger social forces that are at work. Now, here again, you know, this engages part of what Reiner said also. I understand the let's call it the deeply pejorative conception of ideology, but I also think that it makes sense, I agree with Lenin and Sorel here, to talk about revolutionary ideologies, ideologies that don't in fact function to support oppressive social orders, but in fact have the function of trying to motivate people to overthrow them. So I wanted a conception of ideology that was broad enough to cover that too. But I think there's one sense in which all ideologies, as I understand them, are cognitively or epistemically deficient. That is, if they are maps, evaluative maps of the social world, they're always simplifying, as maps always are, and they include generalizations that are false. So from an epistemic standpoint, they're all defective. And you want to say that's a pejorative notion of ideology, that's fine. But I don't think they have to be pejorative in the sense of always functioning just to support oppressive social orders. Because I'd like to think of sort of revolutionary ideologies as not being an abuse of the term. But again, you know, this, in some ways, this is kind of just a definitional matter and a terminological matter. And the question is, what are you really trying to do with the concept of ideology? And is your concept of ideology up to that kind of task? Now, well, anyway, I guess I'm just worried that if you focus on the sort of strongly pejorative notion of ideology, then you may overlook the fact that it's just possible that ideologies are necessary for human beings, even in just societies. That is, that they may form a basis for coordination of values and beliefs that are necessary for successful cooperation, at least in large-scale complex societies. That's a possibility, I think. I mean, Marx obviously thought that ideologies weren't inevitable for human beings, and so there wouldn't be ideologies after we reached a state of the classless society. But I'm not convinced of that. I tend to view ideologies in terms of their function of coordinating beliefs and motivations and behavior. And I'm open to the possibility that something like that might be needed in any large-scale complex society to get the kind of convergence of beliefs and attitudes to make social cooperation work effectively. So this comes from my sort of looking at ideologies as a cultural evolutionary adaptation to the demands of cooperation in complex societies. There's a lot about this in the book, but also one of the things that I didn't include, and should have included my brief characterization of what I mean by ideology in this paper that's in the book, is that I think that ideologies typically, if not uniformly, not only provide an evaluative map of the social world, but they do so in a way that make group identities salient and typically distinguish between us and the other, and have a much more favorable presentation of us and a correspondingly negative characterization of the other, of other groups. So anyway, I just apologize for not, doing justice to my own, still probably admittedly inadequate understanding of what ideology is in this paper. Now, again, this is all inadequate. I'm going to have to move on. Reiner raises two challenges, one about the connection between normative and factual beliefs, the other about the nature of ideologies. And again, I think he rightly questions whether I've been demanding enough in my conception of what it is to have a firm grasp of principles of justice. And here, I think there's a fork in the road that I mentioned before. You can either say, yeah, let's operate with a fairly undemanding notion of what it is to have a firm grasp of principles of justice, and if so, then you've got the problems that I mentioned. The other is, no, having a firm grasp of principles of justice is much more complicated, much more demanding, and implicates a much larger web of beliefs and motivations than the leaner notion of what it is to have a grasp. But then the conclusion is that getting enough people to have a firm grasp of principles of justice is an incredibly daunting prospect. It's really difficult. It's a huge impediment to justice. So that's pretty much what I would say. Now, again, on ideology, I think a question here is what's meant by masking when we say that ideologies mask injustices. And look, I think that's primarily what ideologies in the strongly pejorative sense do. They mask injustices, and I talk about different ways they do that in the book that I just mentioned. But I think that there's a narrower sense of masking in which it's inadequate to say that that's all ideologies do. And here, I'm coming back to something that Sally said. Maybe I just have a sort of cartoonish grasp of what ideology theorists in the Marxist tradition mean by masking, right? If Reiner's right that there are sort of more subtle ways in which ideologies can mask injustices, then fine, I'll agree with that. I just wanted to point out that there's one sense of masking, according to which is not true that ideologies function just by masking injustices. All right, now let's see where we are. Okay, Margaret. It's interesting, Margaret.
Alan, you froze. Ruth, can we fix that?
Just bear with me a moment and I'll see if we can maybe ask Alan to rejoin the meeting.
Thank you. Let's see.
I mean, maybe we should take a break.
Maybe we'll take that. The session is actually
back.
supposed to end in 8 minutes. So
coffee anyway. It's very early in Tucson. Right?
I think whoever wants to get a coffee should get a coffee, but the session is supposed to end in 8 minutes, which is why I'm reluctant to give an official break to the session, because by the time we reconvene, we will need to end.
What, do you want to take a couple of questions?
Yeah, let's see. Maybe we'll do that. Maybe we'll ask people if they have questions, and then I'll collect those, and we'll see if
Can you?
in the meanwhile. So if you have questions, please either raise your hand virtually by clicking on the hand icon, or write your question in the chat.
I can hear you, Alan.
Oh, can you hear me now?
Yeah, we can.
Oh, okay.
Fine. Sorry for the interruption. Something went wrong with the connection, but we're connected now. Margaret interestingly points out that the Black Lives Matter phenomenon looks like a case where the evidence of the seriousness of racial injustice is so strong that people can't be discharging their epistemic responsibilities relative to their commitment of justice and persist in thinking that injustice is not a serious matter. I agree entirely. I just don't think that is in any way contrary to what I say. What I say is that there are cases where people can fulfill their epistemic responsibilities on any reasonable conception of what that is, and still hold these false beliefs about progress and justice. So the fact that there's a case where that's not true really doesn't affect the analysis at all. And my hope is that there will be more events like the Black Lives Matter phenomena that will confront people with what I call an irritant that will cause them to rethink their understanding of the prospects for justice. So I don't have a problem with that, but I think it's a good example of how if the irritant is strong enough, if the phenomenon that forces the evidence on people, or at least makes it appropriate that they should look at it, is if that works well, then that shows how you can remove one impediment to justice. So I think that's important in that respect. Now, I just use the phrase pessimism or optimism as kind of shorthand for what I was saying. I don't think of it as a psychological proclivity at all. It's not a matter of individual psychology. So I may have been misleading in using that shorthand. So I agree with Margaret that if that's how you were looking at it, it's not very helpful, because it makes it sound like it's just some fact about individual psychology that's not connected to social structural injustice and other things in the way that I think ideologies are. So I don't really have any problem with that, but I commend her for pointing out that I wasn't clear about that.
Alan,
sorry.
Alan, we are running out of time. Would you like to take a couple of questions from the audience?
Absolutely, yeah. I'll shut up, and I'm sorry I went too long, but the commentators were just so good that it's hard not to try to respond. Okay, please go ahead.
Good. Yeah. So if you have a question for Alan or one of the commentators, please raise your hand using the hand icon on the screen, or you can just write your question in the chat.
Is this agreement or stunned astonishment at how wrong I've been? It left you speechless.
Yeah, there has to be agreement. So I have a question from Serena Seretti. Serena, you can ask your question. Your microphone is not on.
Can you mute?
Would you like to write your question and I'll read it? Okay, so I'm gonna read the question for those who are unable to look at the screen. What are the most important or desirable forms of political action for reducing undue optimism and undue pessimism under present political circumstances? And a second related question, what is the criterion for optimism and pessimism to qualify as undue?
Yeah, well, I'm not sure I can answer the second question. I'll probably inadequately answer the first. I think that political action of the sort that has taken place with the Black Lives Movement is a great way of trying to overcome falsely optimistic beliefs about progress and racial justice. I think there have to be disruptions, and this here I'm following Sally's work. There have to be often disruptions that can serve as a sufficient irritant to shake people out of complacency about their explicit or tacit empirical beliefs that influence their views about what's been accomplished in regarding justice or what can be accomplished. So I think that this is a case where just philosophers telling people that justice persists is not going to be adequate, that there's got to be some kind of mobilization on the part of people who already know that to try to create a situation which will intrude upon the consciousness of other people and make them take notice of the mistakes they've been making. So I think that's really important. And again, I think it just shows that overly cognitive or rationalistic approaches to overcoming injustice are just wrong for reasons that Sally has made very clear in her work, that it's got to be really much more a matter of practices and disruptive social practices.
Okay, unfortunately, there's no more time for questions, so I think we'll have to end here. But thanks to Alan and to Sally, Margaret, Cécile, and Rainer for a fantastic discussion. Alan's lecture, together with the comments and further replies, will appear in the Journal of Applied Philosophy. So today we started engaging with these questions, but there'll be time to engage with these questions more in the future. So all remains to do is to thank our speakers once again.
Thank you. Thank you for having us.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you for your generosity.
Bye.
Coming. Bye.